The screaming began just moments before the clock struck 12. It wasn't the sound of physical pain. It was something far more chilling, an animal-like primal cry, as if a soul were clawing its way out of a burning cage. A sound so sharp and unnatural that even the palace guards pressed themselves against the cold stone walls, trying to escape a scream that seemed to vibrate the air itself. It echoed through the women's quarters of Golestan Palace in 1847, and every princess, concubine, and servant inside those golden halls knew exactly what it meant. Another mind had reached its breaking point. Her name was Zahra, 16 years old, a princess of the Qajar dynasty, granddaughter of a line that had ruled Persia with absolute authority for generations. By sunrise, she would be the wife of a powerful statesman, a man who had effectively purchased her future in exchange for ruling 3 provinces. But by midnight, something far more valuable had already been taken from her: her sense of safety. She no longer felt ownership of her own body. She could no longer fall asleep without jolting awake at 3 a.m., trembling from a terror she could not name, but would never escape. In the adjoining chamber, the older women who had prepared her sat on silk cushions, drinking tea in silence. No one reacted to the screams, no exchanged glances, no pity. They had done this before. They would do it again. Because what they performed over the last 6 months was not wedding preparation. It was not etiquette. It was not tradition. It was a system refined over generations, a method of psychological dismantling disguised as culture. The empire's most carefully maintained open secret. Before we descend deeper into this hidden architecture of obedience and suffering, if you believe suppressed histories deserve to be told, hit that like button and subscribe.
And before we go further, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? I genuinely want to know which corners of the world are hearing these truths that were never meant to escape the shadows. History doesn't belong locked away in an archive. It belongs to you, to all of us who refuse to let empires bury the suffering they created. This is the untold story of the brides of the Persian court. This is the fate they feared more than death itself. In the Ottoman and Qajar palaces of the 18th and 19th centuries, the daughters of royalty were not raised for love, companionship, or choice. They were raised for control. The so-called preparation process, a ritual so secretive it appears only in coded fragments across palace documents, was engineered with one terrifying objective: erase the girl, install obedience, deliver a perfectly compliant bride. By the time Zahra walked toward her husband's chamber on that November night in 1847, her free will wasn't just suppressed, it had been dismantled piece by piece. The wedding night wasn't the tragedy. The tragedy was the 6 months of psychological disassembly that preceded it. The Qajar dynasty ruled Persia from 1785 to 1925, a reign sprawling from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf, from the deserts of Baluchistan to the mountains of Azerbaijan. They built palaces that shimmered like illusions and amassed treasures that drained entire kingdoms. But every empire built on absolute power eventually learns the same truth. Dominance is fragile, resistance is the enemy. And nowhere was that logic enforced more brutally than on the women of the royal bloodline. A daughter of the Shah was never truly a daughter. She was a bargaining chip, a diplomatic offering, a human contract wrapped in silk. Her body was political currency, her marriage was state strategy, and her personal will? That vanished the moment she entered the world. The moment a king wished to reward a general, secure a border, or cement loyalty, a daughter was offered as the seal. Not a participant, not a bride in any meaningful sense, collateral. Zahra had understood this long before her own name appeared on the list. She had watched older sisters and cousins disappear behind unfamiliar palace walls, never to return the same, if they returned at all. She learned it from the whisper that carried more weight than any decree: duty. But there is an ocean-sized difference between knowing your destiny and standing in the moment it finally crushes you.
Zahra's world shifted on a warm spring afternoon in 1847. She was 14. Her fate was decided in a council room she was not permitted to enter, debated by men she had never met, and finalized with the cold precision of a military order. Her future husband, her owner in everything but name, was Mirza Hassan Khan, a commander with vast holdings in the north. He was 43. Behind him lay a trail of tragedies. 2 previous wives, both gone. One died in childbirth. The other, palace documents claim, succumbed to melancholy, a convenient phrase often used when a woman's spirit broke so completely that her body soon followed. Zahra was selected as wife number 3, not because she was cherished, not because she was desired, but because her bloodline was politically useful. No one explained this to her directly. They didn't need to. The truth revealed itself in the silence that settled over the palace like dust. The warm glances from attendants became rigid neutrality. Her daily freedoms, walking the gardens, reading manuscripts, speaking openly, were stripped away without a word. A eunuch appeared behind her, shadowing her every movement. Male servants were forbidden to address her. Her clothing was replaced with garments designed not for comfort, but for containment. The cage wasn't built overnight, but she felt every bar lock into place. Her entire world narrowed into a single, suffocating reality: preparation for the wedding night. This is where the true dismantling began, slow, deliberate, and disturbingly precise. The women assigned to guide her were revered within the palace, though many were not much older than the girls they conditioned. Their titles sounded noble, ceremonial: overseer of brides, mistress of ritual, guardian of conduct. But these were not mentors. They were specialists in erasing identity, women shaped by the same machinery they now enforced. They understood human psychology intuitively, not from books or theories, but from generations of practice. They knew exactly how to press on the fragile architecture of a young woman's mind until it buckled in the right places. And the first structure they targeted was her voice. Across 6 relentless months, Zahra's ability to express herself was hollowed out piece by piece. She was only allowed to speak when addressed, and even then, she was confined to a set of pre-approved responses. Yes, if it pleases you. Forgive my shortcomings. I await your instruction. Opinions were forbidden. Emotion was forbidden. Selfhood, most of all, was forbidden. Any deviation, any hint that Zahra still saw herself as a person rather than an instrument, triggered immediate psychological punishment. The first tool in their arsenal was isolation. One misplaced word meant hours or days sealed inside her chamber. Meals left at the threshold, windows shuttered, human contact severed. Even worse than solitude was the social erasure that followed. Other girls undergoing their own training were ordered to treat her as if she no longer existed. They averted their eyes when she passed. They separated themselves during lessons. Some looked through her with the chilling indifference reserved for ghosts. It wasn't discipline, it was conditioning, calculated, repeated exposure to silence and invisibility until the mind stopped reaching for connection. The reasoning behind this assault on language was as elegant as it was terrifying. Human identity is built on words. Language is how we shape our memories, how we define our boundaries, how we hold on to the idea of who we are. When you can name an emotion, you can confront it. When you can express a fear, you can examine it. When you can speak freely, you remain human. By confining Zahra to a list of 43 pre-approved phrases, the system wasn't simply controlling her speech, it was dismantling the internal scaffolding that allowed her to think clearly. When she lost the words to describe her fear, that fear didn't fade. It hardened inside her like stone. When she lost the language of questioning, confusion ceased to be a moment and became her entire worldview. Without the vocabulary of self-protection, vulnerability stopped being a feeling and became her default setting. And the women running this system, the architects of erasure, were only just beginning. Next, they turned the other victims into weapons. 7 young women were being conditioned alongside Zahra, but instead of forming bonds, They were manipulated into becoming each other's silent tormentors. The rules were cruel in their brilliance. If one girl slipped, every girl suffered. It meant that a single misstep from one victim triggered consequences for all. Fear became communal. Suspicion became currency. And the girls learned to monitor each other with the same intensity as their overseers. Zahra witnessed the mechanism in action. One evening, a girl named Zahra tried to calm another initiate who was spiraling into a panic attack. Instead of offering compassion, the system punished both. Zahra was told she had interfered with necessary discipline. The trembling girl was told that Zahra's kindness was not love, it was weakness, an obstacle to the strength the palace claimed to be instilling. By the end of the night, the message was unmistakable. Comfort was dangerous. Connection was forbidden. Solidarity was punishable. And that was exactly the point.
By the time dawn crept through the palace lattices, the girls could no longer meet each other's eyes. Zahra had absorbed the lesson carved into her over the last weeks. Connection is risk. Empathy is punishment. Safety comes only from silence. The psychology behind it was brutally effective. In a palace where affection didn't exist, where every adult carried the emotional temperature of polished marble, and where her peers had been weaponized into fearful enforcers, social isolation became a slow-motion erasure of the self. Within a matter of weeks, Zahra's voice withered. She spoke only when ordered. But silence is never an empty space. In that hollow quiet, her mind began manufacturing its own torment. Every glance from an overseer felt like a hidden accusation. She began imagining conversations that never happened, hearing phantom criticisms buried in the shuffle of footsteps. Her senses sharpened into constant, exhausting awareness, an instinctive scanning for danger that never truly stopped. She was no longer living in her body, she was enduring it, like a nerve exposed to the cold air, flinching at everything. And once her identity had been weakened, once her thoughts no longer fully belonged to her, the next phase began. They turned their attention to her physical autonomy. The movement training she now endured bore no resemblance to the poised etiquette lessons taught to royal girls. It wasn't about grace, it wasn't about refinement, it was obedience, distilled into choreography. Every morning at sunrise, for 3 relentless hours, Zahra was forced to perform what the overseers called the 8 movements of submission. These weren't gestures, they were psychological architecture. Each motion was crafted to collapse dignity, to rewire posture into compliance, to ensure that even her body forgot how to resist. Her spine had to lower at a precise angle. Her hands had to fold in a way that subtly immobilized them. Her gaze had to drop just enough to show deference, but not enough to appear disoriented. Her shoulders were repositioned until they learned how to mimic defeat. Nothing was natural. Everything was engineered. And with every passing day, Zahra's body stopped feeling like a vessel she owned, and more like a uniform she was being forced to wear. Every movement she was forced to perform served one purpose: the slow, deliberate erasure of the self. Each gesture conveyed a different shape of obedience. There was the lowering bow, where the eyes had to fall to the floor before the spine even began to tilt, because the loss of gaze was the first surrender. There was the offering bow, a motion that transformed a standing princess into a kneeling vessel. And worst of all, the backward bow, a retreat performed without turning away from authority, a maneuver almost impossible to execute, which meant one thing: constant failure, and therefore endless correction. Precision wasn't encouraged, it was demanded. Her neck had to incline at exactly 30 degrees. 35 was excessive humility, interpreted as weakness. 25 was dangerous pride, a suggestion of hidden defiance. Only 30, the calculated midpoint between invisibility and usefulness, was acceptable. Her hands became prisoners of an unspoken rule. They could never rise higher than her heart. Her steps were reduced to tiny, hesitant movements that barely covered the length of her own foot. It was unmistakably clear. They weren't teaching her how to move, they were teaching her how to disappear. But the training wasn't merely physical, it was neurological conditioning. The intention was chilling. They wanted Zahra's nervous system, her reflexes, her instincts, her very spine, to obey before her mind could think, so that the instant her future husband appeared, her body would automatically fold into submission as naturally as breath. A reaction, not a choice. A reflex, not a decision. A posture so deeply imprinted that resistance would feel as unnatural as speaking in a forgotten language.
Hour after hour, Zahra repeated the same motions until her body trembled and her mind slipped into a fog. This wasn't training anymore, it was conditioning. The repetition hollowed her out, pushing her into a dreamlike state where the body moved, but the self no longer participated. Exactly the outcome her overseers wanted. The older women monitored her with unsettling stillness, like hunters waiting for their prey to collapse. Their corrections carried no warmth, only precision and cruelty. Zainab, the enforcer of the group, barked orders with the sharpness of a blade. "Your back is too straight. That posture reeks of defiance," she snapped, before pressing her palm between Zahra's shoulder blades and forcing her downward until her spine strained into submission. "Lower. You're still holding on to yourself. Let go." Mariam, the mistress of psychological pressure, circled Zahra with the practiced eye of someone evaluating an object, not a human being. "Your gaze," she whispered coldly, "is far too direct. Eyes down, always down, unless you wish to invite disaster on your very first night." But the worst moments weren't the corrections, they were the public lessons. If Zahra took even one step with a hint of her former confidence, if her shoulders lifted naturally, if her chin rose a millimeter too high, training stopped. A punishment performance began. The other girls, already shaken, already exhausted, were summoned to witness her failure. Zainab would extend her hand toward Zahra, like presenting a cautionary exhibit. "Observe," she announced, her voice echoing across the chamber. "This is what arrogance looks like. This is the posture of a girl who still clings to the illusion that she matters." Then, turning back to Zahra, "We will repeat this until every trace of pride is gone." It wasn't discipline, it was humiliation weaponized into obedience. And in a palace where every interaction was watched, judged, and recorded, shame became more devastating than pain. The constant surveillance, the feeling of eyes tracking her every movement, every breath, became a weight she could no longer carry. It wasn't the rules that crushed her, it was the fear of breaking a rule she could no longer remember. Day after day, Zahra began to experience her own body as an enemy. Her muscles trembled under the strain, her neck throbbed from being held at angles no human form was designed for. Even her gaze became a battlefield. Looking down correctly required an emotional resignation she could barely muster. And slowly, painfully, she realized she was failing at the only task her existence had been reduced to, performing her own insignificance. What she was learning wasn't etiquette, it was an entirely new language, the physical grammar of helplessness. Modern psychology has a name for this. The body remembers what the mind tries to erase. Zahra's shoulders had begun to curl inward permanently. Her breath grew shallow. Her steps became tiny, hesitant flinches instead of movement. Her nervous system was being trained, rewired, to live in constant anticipation of correction. The overseers were not breaking her spirit, they were reprogramming her biology. By the end of the 6th month, Zahra's body held a truth she couldn't articulate, but could no longer escape. You do not belong to yourself. Your movements are not yours. Even your presence occupies space only by permission. The conditioning ran so deep that even when she was alone, inside the safety of her locked chamber, her body betrayed her. She would catch herself shrinking into corners, lowering her head instinctively, as if bowing to a phantom authority that wasn't even there. The girl she had been was gone. In her place stood a shape molded by fear, carved by obedience, and hollowed out until submission became its only instinct. Her body had become her enemy, moving with automatic submission even when her mind was silently screaming for dignity. She was no longer reacting. She was programmed. Every gesture she made felt borrowed, rehearsed, drained of any trace of the girl she used to be. But the physical conditioning was only the first layer. The true psychological dismantling required something far more active and far more terrifying. The overseers called it the testing. Officially, this was framed as preparation for her husband's expectations. In reality, it was a mechanism designed to inject permanent dread into her nervous system, a way to ensure Zahra lived in a state of hyper-alert fear, even in rooms where nothing was happening. The testing was essentially a twisted theater of power. Zainab, the most ruthless of the mistresses, played the role of the husband. But she did not portray a man who was kind or stable. She performed him as a force of absolute unpredictability, quick to anger, impossible to appease, and permanently disappointed. The entire exercise was a trap. Zahra would be instructed to approach. She would execute every bow, every gesture, every angle of her body exactly as she had been trained. She would be perfect. And then, without warning, without logic, without even the illusion of fairness, the scenario would turn hostile. Zainab's expression would shift into ice. Her voice would sharpen with manufactured disgust. "You did that wrong," she would snap. "I've seen peasant girls move with more grace. Your husband will be ashamed to claim you. Imagine that, being rejected on your very first night. What then? Will you crawl home in disgrace?" There was no mistake to correct, no instruction to apply, no right answer. The point was to teach her that failure was inevitable, that danger was constant, that safety did not exist. Slowly, Zahra's nervous system learned the lesson. No matter what you do, you are always at risk. This was the entire purpose of the testing. Not preparation, not training, but the installation of permanent, paralyzing vigilance. The human mind breaks far faster from unpredictability than from pain, and they knew it. Zainab never needed to raise a hand to break her. Her words did the work far more efficiently. She would let certain threats linger just long enough for Zahra's imagination to torture her with possibilities far worse than anything spoken aloud. "You're too slow, too dull, too stiff," she would murmur with theatrical disappointment. "Why would a great Khan choose you when he could take any woman in Persia?" The cruelty wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was precise, surgical. Zainab would perform a greeting incorrectly on purpose, breaking every rule she had drilled into the girl for months. Zahra would freeze, horrified and confused. And that hesitation was the cue. "You should have known this was a test," she would erupt. "A proper wife anticipates her husband's needs before he even thinks them. But you just stood there, watching me fail. Pathetic." It was a masterclass in psychological sabotage. Zahra's trust in her own perception crumbled. If Zainab could violate the ritual and still blame her, then reality was no longer something Zahra could rely on. She was responsible not only for her own actions, but for Zainab's moods, mistakes, and imagined expectations. And then came the tactic that did the most damage, the silent erasure. Without explanation, without even a shift in tone, Zainab would suddenly behave as if Zahra had vanished from existence. She would turn her back, speak around her, step past her, never once acknowledging her presence. She would address the other older women in a calm, almost bored voice. "I don't know how much more I can tolerate from her. Did you see the way she moves? Stiff, heavy, embarrassing. Her husband will be ashamed. She will burden him from the first night." Zahra stood there, breathing the same air, but treated as a ghost. Not punished through violence, punished through non-existence. And the message seeped deeper than any threat ever could. If you are not perfect, you are nothing. If you make a mistake, you disappear. Your value is conditional, fragile, temporary. It was the exact psychological state the system was designed to create. The moment Zahra learned to fear invisibility more than pain, the final layer of her will began to collapse. The older women would simply nod, slow, solemn, deliberate. Their quiet agreement was the final confirmation. Zahra had ceased to exist in their eyes. She was being erased while her body was still occupying the room. This tactic, being surrounded by people who consciously refuse to acknowledge you, is one of the deepest forms of psychological injury. It is a wound without a mark, a cut that bleeds inward. Humans are not built to survive isolation. We are wired to read faces, seek belonging, and anchor our identity in social connection. When a group deliberately looks through you instead of at you, the brain interprets it as a kind of death, and that was exactly the point. These episodes of engineered invisibility inflicted a level of harm no physical blow could replicate. The ritual was systematic. Every scenario was designed to corner her. Every choice she made was predetermined to be wrong. If she tried to improve, she was overstepping, exposing an unattractive hunger for approval. If she stayed composed, she was labeled emotionless, unfit to meet her husband's expectations. If she apologized, she was accused of groveling. If she endured quietly, she was described as prideful and defiant. It didn't matter what she did. The punishment was already scripted. There was no correct path. There was no version of Zahra that earned safety. And this deliberate unpredictability created one of the most dangerous psychological states known to trauma science: learned helplessness.
It occurs when a person realizes, deep in the bones, that nothing they do changes the outcome. When reward and punishment are random. When logic disappears and the world becomes a trap sprung at unpredictable intervals. A mind in this state eventually shuts down its internal navigation. It stops solving, stops resisting, stops imagining escape. It adopts one devastating belief: nothing I do matters. And once that belief settles into the nervous system, the will collapses. For Zahra, the chaos wasn't accidental. The unpredictability was the weapon. It was the most efficient method of breaking her autonomy without leaving a single visible scar.
The terror never followed a schedule, and that was intentional. Zahra could be summoned without warning, midway through a meal, during a quiet moment of prayer, or while simply walking down an empty hallway. There was no sanctuary, no predictable rhythm to cling to. The unpredictability was the punishment. Whether she performed flawlessly or made a genuine mistake didn't matter. The outcome was always the same: fear. Her body adapted to survive in a world where danger could erupt at any moment. Her pulse lived in her throat. Her shoulders stayed tight, locked in a permanent flinch. A small, frantic part of her mind was always awake, scanning for threats she could never quite identify. By the third month, her body could no longer keep up. Sleep abandoned her. She lay awake at night, trapped beneath the weight of spiraling thoughts, endless catastrophic what-ifs. And when exhaustion finally dragged her under, it was never rest. Her sleep shattered into fragments, haunted by nightmares she couldn't remember but could feel: shame, dread, and a lingering sense that something inside her had been taken. Then came the ritual of the 3 a.m. panic, the hour when trauma wakes its victims. Zahra would jolt upright, gasping as though dragged from underwater. Her heart pounded as if trying to escape her chest. Her bedclothes clung to her, drenched in cold sweat. There was no dream behind it, no memory she could grasp, only the raw panic her nervous system had learned to summon on command. Her body had become its own torturer. And the cruel truth? Her suffering wasn't treated as a warning sign. The older women watched her tremble. They noticed the hollow look in her eyes, the way her hands shook, the way sleep seemed to hover just out of reach. And they approved. "She's finally learning," they murmured, loud enough for Zahra to hear, but with no invitation to respond. The proper fear is in her now, the kind that makes a bride obedient. Mirza Hassan Khan will have no trouble with this one. To them, her collapse wasn't a tragedy. It was progress. Sleep deprivation wasn't an unfortunate side effect of her training. It was a deliberate tool, one of the most effective psychological weapons ever engineered. History is painfully clear. When you take sleep away, the mind unravels faster than the body. Thoughts stop connecting. Emotions slip out of control. The defenses that protect the self, identity, judgment, resistance, begin to crumble. Keeping Zahra trapped in a cycle of exhaustion and fear made her mind soft,
malleable, easy to reshape. And once her mental resilience had thinned to silk, the next phase of her dismantling began, the medical breakdown. Every week, Zahra was brought before Dr. Mirza Bahram, a man who had served the palace for decades. He wasn't a healer, he was the gatekeeper of the dynasty's expectations. He had examined young women for nearly 30 years. To him, the process was no longer shocking, it was routine. His examinations were not acts of protection, they were audits. He approached Zahra with the same dispassionate calm someone might use when inspecting a valuable artifact. His hands moved with precision, not compassion. He pushed her limbs beyond their natural limits, testing her flexibility with movements that delivered small bursts of pain she had already been trained to endure without reaction. He measured everything with meticulous, almost obsessive detail. Her height, her shoulder span, the width of her hips, the expansion of her lungs. Each number was recorded in thick, leather-bound ledgers, archives that still exist, chilling in how they reduce a young girl's body to a series of biological statistics, the same way livestock are evaluated before breeding. These examinations weren't about health, they were about ownership. They reinforced the one truth the system never allowed Zahra to forget. Your body is no longer yours. It belongs to the palace, the dynasty, the husband-to-be. Its value is not who you are, but what you can produce. You are not being examined, you are being claimed.
The examinations didn't stop at measurements. There were deeper procedures, rituals disguised as medicine, said to determine her readiness for marriage. The details were buried beneath layers of formal terminology, vague phrases crafted to hide the reality of what was being done to her. But the worst part wasn't the procedure itself, it was the unpredictability. There was no pattern, no routine to brace for. Zahra could be summoned at sunrise or long after midnight. She might be dragged straight from a meal or pulled in while trembling from hunger. One day she was examined in a brightly lit chamber, the next in a dim side room with different attendants. The inconsistency was intentional. It prevented her from building psychological armor. It denied her the comfort of mental rehearsal. Every session struck her like a new and unexpected blow. These intrusions were framed as medical necessity, but their purpose mirrored everything else in her training, to teach her that her body was not her territory. Her comfort didn't factor into the equation. Her consent was irrelevant. Her physical boundaries were treated as illusions she must forget. Each examination carved the same message deeper into her bones. You are not a person with ownership. You are an object that can be accessed, evaluated, and controlled at will. When the sessions ended, Zahra often drifted back to her chamber in a fog-like trance. She would sit alone, motionless, staring at her hands as though they belonged to someone else. Sometimes she would press her fingers lightly against her own skin, desperate to feel something, anything, and sense only a distant numbness. It was as if her consciousness had stepped away, watching from a safe distance while the body endured what she could no longer bear to process. This dissociation wasn't weakness, it was survival, a last attempt by the mind to shield itself. But for many young women trapped in this system, that separation became permanent. The part of them that could feel, hope, or resist never returned. Dissociation is the final emergency switch of the human mind, the last firewall between a person and a reality too overwhelming to endure. When life becomes a battlefield with no exit, the mind does something extraordinary. It steps outside of itself. It observes rather than feels. It watches from a distance while the body absorbs the impact. It's an ancient survival mechanism, an evolutionary miracle that allows a person to live through experiences that should break them entirely. But survival comes at a cost, because the person who returns to that body is never the same one who left. They come back in pieces, still breathing but altered, still standing but splintered. And many never manage to gather all those fragments again. Once Zahra's sense of self was cracked and drifting, the preparations entered their most disturbing phase, the instruction for the marriage bed. Her teacher for this chapter was Soraya, once the wife of a powerful governor, now a palace-appointed instructor whose sole duty was to shape young brides into instruments of obedience. What she taught was not connection, not partnership, not knowledge. It was elimination. Zahra spoke in vague, coded phrases, using abstractions designed to provoke fear while providing no clarity. Every explanation was a shadow, every guideline an implication. She never taught Zahra what was going to happen, only what she must not do. She spoke of duty in a tone devoid of humanity. She warned of the danger of refusal, though she never defined what refusal meant. When she described the wedding night, it was with the cold precision of someone outlining a procedure. How to hold still, how to avoid drawing attention, how to quiet one's breathing until it became invisible. "Your comfort is irrelevant," she said in a voice stripped of emotion. "Your preferences do not matter. You are expected to endure. That is your role." Zahra was not taught to understand her own body. She was trained to disconnect from it. She was not taught partnership. She was taught stillness. In Zahra's lessons, Zahra was not becoming a bride. She was being sculpted into an object. The combination of enforced ignorance and unrelenting fear created a perfect psychological trap. The silence between lessons became its own weapon, because Zahra's imagination filled the gaps with terrors far greater than anything spoken aloud. By the 5th month, she had slipped into what modern psychology describes as depersonalization. She no longer experienced her life from the inside. She drifted above it. She watched herself move through the palace corridors, as if observing a stranger from afar. She heard her own carefully scripted responses, but the voice felt detached, like a distant echo belonging to someone she once knew. Piece by piece, she was dissolving. Then came the moment that finished the job. 1 week before the ceremony, she was summoned to a secluded chamber, lit only by a single oil lamp. The shadows stretched long across the walls, and in the center of the room was a low wooden table. Upon it lay an assortment of unfamiliar objects, tools whose purposes were unclear, but whose presence radiated a chilling message: control, expectation, power. Zainab stood beside the table with her usual cold, unblinking composure. Her voice carried no emotion, no warning, just a flat declaration, as though she were cataloguing items in a storeroom. "These may be required by your husband," she said. "You will not react. You will not question. You will remain composed, because we have prepared you to feel nothing." The words struck with surgical precision, and in that instant, something inside Zahra didn't bend. It broke. It wasn't poetic, it wasn't symbolic, it was visceral. A sudden, silent collapse deep inside her chest, like the cracking of thin ice under too much weight. A door inside her mind slammed shut, not to be opened again. Her final emotional defense, exhausted, overworked and starved, burned out completely. Zahra did not faint. She did not cry. She simply disappeared inward. The body remained standing in that dim room, but the person it belonged to had stepped away. The girl was gone. Only the bride remained. And that was when her body finally rebelled. Her mind may have been subdued, but her physiology refused to accept the fate forced upon it. Panic struck her in violent, uncontrollable waves, her heart slamming inside her chest like a wild animal, her lungs clenching as if the air itself had turned hostile. The world blurred, sound distorted. She genuinely thought she was dying. But the palace did not offer comfort. They offered control. The physician who arrived was not a healer. He was an instrument of compliance. He carried no warmth, only a vial of thick amber liquid, an opiate-based sedative administered with clinical indifference. The medicine did not soothe. It erased. The fear vanished, yes, but so did her clarity, her instincts, her remaining fragments of self. She drifted through the final days as a muted silhouette, moving with slow, mechanical obedience. The older women watched this hollowed-out version of her and nodded approvingly. "This," they whispered, "is readiness." The wedding morning broke beneath a bleak November sky, washed in the color of forged iron. The wind carried the sting of an early winter, slicing through the palace corridors. Servants flooded her chamber with the efficiency of artisans preparing a fragile object. They did not speak to her. People do not speak to ceremonial artifacts. They lifted, arranged, dressed, and tightened as if assembling an offering demanded by the state itself. The dress was beautiful in the way cages are sometimes beautiful. White silk, heavy with gold embroidery that weighed on her shoulders like a physical sentence. Every thread shimmered with luxury while simultaneously suffocating her. Standing upright became an act of endurance. Her hair was twisted and pinned into an ornate structure, so rigid it felt like a crown of iron. Her face was powdered into artificial perfection, smooth, expressionless, a mask. Then came the jewelry, cold stones, each one carrying a history she wished she did not know. The servants worked silently, but the palace always gossiped, and so she understood exactly what wrapped around her neck. These jewels had once adorned Hassan Khan's second wife, the woman who had faded, as the records said, swallowed by a sorrow no one dared name. The implication was carved into every cold facet of the gems. You are temporary. You are replaceable. You are simply the next body to wear these chains. The ceremony that followed was mercifully short, not a celebration, but an execution of paperwork, a contract affirmed, a transfer finalized. The empire had completed its transaction. She wasn't even asked to speak. An elderly male relative, chosen not for closeness but for convenience, stood in her place, offering consent on her behalf. When the ceremonial question was asked, a servant discreetly pressed her side. The soft, unfocused sound that escaped her lips, born not of agreement but of sedation, was accepted by the mullah as approval. With a stroke of ink, her fate was sealed. The contract complete, her identity replaced with ownership. For the next 6 hours, she sat perfectly still on a throne-like platform, displayed like a relic. Hundreds of guests filed in, celebrating a union she had no part in choosing. They offered blessings, shared laughter, exchanged toasts, all while the girl at the center of the event floated through the scene as if watching someone else's life unfold. The opium held her upright, but it also held her captive inside her own skull, observing the world through fogged glass. When night finally descended, the final stage of the ritual began. The older women removed her jewelry and washed her in rose-scented water, an aroma traditionally meant to symbolize purity, but one that now only masked the quiet tremor in her breath. She was clothed in a thin ceremonial gown, meant to signify transition, not comfort. Then came the final dose, stronger than the rest, a deliberate quieting of the mind. Mariam, the ancient overseer, guided her down the dimly lit corridor. Her expression was carved from stone, her eyes emptied by decades of repeating this same grim task. There was no kindness left in her. She had delivered too many girls into a fate she could neither alter nor question. The bridal chamber itself was a set piece, an immaculate stage crafted for appearances. Red silk cascaded down the walls. Hundreds of candles threw warm, wavering light across the room. The bed stood in the center, covered in immaculate white linens. To an outsider, it would look lavish, soft, warm, luxurious. But to Zahra, it was something else entirely. It was the final doorway, a ceremonial room dressed in beauty to disguise the weight of dread pressing against her ribs. A space designed to look inviting, yet filled with the suffocating stillness of inevitability. The elegance of the chamber was not comforting, it was haunting. A carefully constructed illusion that tried, but failed, to hide the truth of what her life had become. Mariam positioned her at the edge of the bed with the same cold precision she had used for every other step of the ritual. She leaned close, her voice brittle and exhausted from years of repeating the same command. "Stay here," she said. "He will arrive shortly. Remember what you've been taught. Keep still." She paused, only long enough to deliver the final instruction with chilling finality. "You will remain silent." Then she turned, left the room, and the heavy metal lock sliding into place echoed through the chamber like a verdict. The last sound Zahra heard before the quiet swallowed her whole was the decisive click of the key turning from the outside. She sat alone in a room so beautiful it bordered on cruelty. Every fabric shimmered, every candle flickered, every detail looked carefully curated to disguise the dread that had taken root in her chest. The sedatives muffled the edges of her thoughts, but not enough to quiet the primal fear pulsing beneath her ribs. She tried to think, tried to stitch together some remnant of her former self, but the training had done its work. 6 months of psychological dismantling left her hollow, unable to access the instincts that once protected her. When Mirza Hassan Khan entered the chamber nearly an hour later, he offered no greeting, no acknowledgement, just the heavy presence of a man who viewed the ritual as a formality, not a partnership. Zahra drifted through the moment in a dissociated haze, watching her own actions not as the subject, but as an observer. The effect of the sedatives created a distance between her mind and her body, a numbness that turned the world into a sequence of muted, disconnected images. She stayed exactly where she had been placed. Compliance had become her default state. The encounter lasted minutes, but to Zahra, it felt suspended outside of time. When it was over, he dressed and left the chamber without speaking or looking back. Long before sunrise, the older women filed in with quiet efficiency. Their expressions were unreadable, their movements precise. They approached the bed not with tenderness, but with the detached professionalism of people performing a required inspection. They examined the linens with solemn focus, searching not for emotional well-being, but for the final piece of ritual evidence the palace demanded. A physical confirmation that the transaction had been completed. In their world, this was not intimacy, this was documentation. And Zahra, still seated where she had been left, felt the cold understanding settle into her bones. Her life now belonged entirely to others. Finding what they came for, the women slipped out of the chamber, with the quiet efficiency of bureaucrats completing a final line of paperwork. Their satisfaction said it all. The state's transaction had been finalized. The dynasty had received exactly what it wanted. And in that silence, something inside Zahra didn't simply break, it collapsed. The scream that ripped through the palace that night, the one that jolted the guards and made the servants freeze in place, had nothing to do with the ritual of the marriage itself. That part she had endured through the numbing haze they had forced upon her. No, the scream came later. It came when the sedatives began to fade, when the dissociation finally cracked, when her mind slammed back into her body with full force. Every fragment of fear, every month of conditioning, every moment of erasure, 6 months of psychological ruin, hit her all at once, like a building caving in. That was the moment Zahra truly vanished. By dawn, the court physicians were summoned. They did not ask questions, they did not comfort her, they administered stronger drugs, heavy, mind-dulling mixtures designed not to heal, but to silence. And it worked. What emerged was not the girl who had entered the palace half a year earlier. It was a shadow of her. She became the version of a wife the system valued most. Quiet, compliant, endlessly manageable. She carried out every duty placed upon her without hesitation. She bore her husband a son within a year, and 3 more children over the next decade. In the official records of the Qajar court, she was praised as an exemplar, steady, obedient, and devoted. But the vibrant young woman who once loved poetry, the curious mind that used to challenge her tutors, the girl who filled notebooks with her own reflections, she never returned. That Zahra had died long before her body did. What remained was a woman moving through life as though underwater, present enough to function, but never fully awake. A ghost dressed in royal silk. Zahra lived for 37 more years. She passed away quietly at 53. No dramatic illness, no violent end. The official record described it as a wasting sickness, but the palace doctors privately admitted something far more tragic. It was as if she simply let go. Her body had absorbed 3 decades of psychological weight, and eventually it decided that maintaining life was no longer worth the effort. She didn't die from disease, she died from depletion, layer upon layer of unspoken pain that finally outweighed her will to continue. And Zahra's story was not an anomaly, it was the system. Across the entire span of Qajar rule, this ritual of dismantling young women was repeated with cold consistency. Dozens of royal daughters were put through the same machinery, each one ground down into a perfectly compliant political offering. Empires crumble. But the machinery of control, the methods, the psychology, the tactics, those never vanish. They simply change shape. Zahra was not the exception. She was the template. The details of the preparation shifted slightly from decade to decade, adjusted for the girl's age or her future husband's rank. But the underlying formula never changed. Break the will, erase the self, install obedience, deliver the product. Many of these women left behind fragments of their suffering, breadcrumbs the historians later pieced together.
Princess Fatima, 1856. On her wedding night, she attempted to escape into the palace gardens. Hours later, guards found her standing barefoot beside a fountain, completely unresponsive, breathing but gone. Doctors described her as present but unreachable, a condition she remained in for the rest of her life. These stories follow the same haunting trajectory, a systematic crushing of identity until nothing remains but the outline of a person. And Zahra, she was only one chapter in a much larger archive of erased lives. Princess Nosrat, 1841, left behind no journals of her own, but the letters exchanged between her sister and aunt paint a devastating picture. After the preparation, they described her as something less than human, a doll animated by unseen hands, answering only when prompted, her thoughts flattened into obedience. Whatever spark she once carried had been carved out of her. And the most horrifying truth? She wasn't an exception. She was evidence of the pattern. These women were not accidental casualties of tradition. They were the intended outcome of a system engineered to produce one specific result: psychological submission so complete that resistance was not merely punished, it became impossible. The chilling consistency across decades proves one thing: the overseers, midwives, and palace physicians understood, with disturbing accuracy, how to dismantle a mind. Even the fragmented records that survive, half-burned letters, coded reports, private memos, repeat the same theme with unnerving clarity. The brides did not fear their wedding night. They feared the 6 months before it, because that was the true crucible, the place where identity was stripped away layer by layer, until nothing remained but the hollow echo of compliance. A physician's journal from 1834 provides one of the clearest windows into this process. In a cold clinical entry describing a 14-year-old girl, 1 month into her training, he writes, "Subject displays controlled psychological deterioration, dissociation, sleep disruption, diminished autonomic response, all signs appropriate for her designated function." That final phrase, appropriate for her designated function, is the Rosetta Stone of the entire system. It reveals the truth no official decree ever dared to admit. The collapse of these girls was not a problem. It was the product. The alliance wasn't sealed by the marriage contract. It was sealed by the destruction of a young woman's inner world. The empire didn't just trade daughters, it traded the carefully engineered silence of their souls. We're often taught that history's worst crimes are the ones that left bruises, burns, and broken bones. But the truth is far darker. Some of the most devastating violence in history never touched the skin at all. It happened silently, inside the mind, leaving no visible trace while destroying everything that made a person human. This is not the plot of a dystopian novel. This was a fully developed system of psychological domination, perfected behind palace walls and buried for more than 100 years. And the methods it refined, coercive control, enforced isolation, the dismantling of identity, are still being used in hidden corners of the world today. The palace called it bride preparation. A gentle name for something that was anything but gentle. For the young women of the royal household, it wasn't a lesson in poise or manners. It was a step-by-step program designed to dismantle autonomy, crush resistance, and replace free will with conditioned obedience. Nothing about it was accidental. Every rule, every ritual, every punishment served one purpose: to break the mind without leaving a mark.
The physicians who monitored the process weren't healers, they were record keepers of psychological collapse. Their job was to measure how effectively a girl's independence had been erased. A few young women tried to resist, and their stories are the most heartbreaking proof of how sophisticated the system truly was. One princess, identified only as Susan in the surviving documents, refused to perform the humiliating 8 movements of submission. She was never struck. That would have been too simple and too visible. Instead, she was placed in absolute isolation. Servants were ordered to walk past her as if she wasn't there. No words, no eye contact, no acknowledgement of her existence. She lived among people, yet experienced the torment of being treated like a phantom. After 3 weeks, she gave in. She performed the movements flawlessly. When one of the overseers asked why she suddenly complied, she answered with chilling clarity, "Because I no longer exist. A ghost cannot disobey." Princess Mariam's attempt at resistance was different and just as tragic. She tried to form a quiet friendship with a servant girl who treated her with kindness. They were immediately separated. Mariam was told the servant had been executed. Historians still don't know whether the girl actually died or whether the palace fabricated the story to punish connection itself. But the psychological effect was absolute. Mariam never reached out to another person again. She learned that affection was dangerous and that human closeness could be punished with annihilation. Another young woman, an avid reader whose mind thrived on poetry and philosophy, attempted one last act of quiet rebellion. She hid her cherished books beneath the bedboards of her training chamber. They were discovered, and in a ritual meant to sever her final connection to herself, the books were burned in front of her. She was told her curiosity was a sickness, something the preparation was meant to cure. After that night, she never read another page. The empire masked this cruelty behind polished words like tradition, protection, and duty. But these terms were nothing more than camouflage, thin veils hiding a deliberate system of psychological dismantling. The darkest revelation is that the women enforcing the process were often survivors of the same conditioning. They had once been broken and now upheld the system that had shattered them, because becoming an administrator of trauma was the only way they could avoid re-experiencing it. Abuse became a cycle. Survival required obedience, and obedience eventually evolved into participation. This history matters not because it sits in some distant, forgotten century, but because it exposes a blueprint of control that still echoes today. The tactics refined within those palace walls, isolation, surveillance, stripping away personal identity, controlling information, fostering hypervigilance, didn't die with the dynasty. They were later examined by interrogators, adopted by high-control groups, replicated in abusive relationships, and absorbed into systems of power that seek domination without ever leaving visible scars. The Qajar system proved something chilling. You can break a person entirely using only psychological force, no bruises required. And once that knowledge escaped the palace, it spread like wildfire. So why do the stories of Zahra and the other young women matter? Because they give us the vocabulary to recognize coercive control today. When we see engineered isolation, enforced dependency, the silencing of a voice, or the systematic shrinking of a person's identity, we know what it is. We can finally name it: psychological torture. And naming it is the first step towards stopping it. Understanding what happened inside those palace walls is not just an academic exercise. It's a shield. A shield against letting these patterns return dressed in modern clothing. A shield against silence. And more importantly, a shield against the kind of power that thrives when no one is looking. If this untold history unsettled you, and it should, then you already understand why these stories matter. Empires polish their own narratives. They erase their crimes. They rewrite their monsters into myth and their victims into footnotes. But the truth survives in fragments, in whispers, and in the strength of the people who refuse to let it die. So now, I want to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching from? Which forgotten women, silenced voices, or buried histories should we uncover next?
Tell me in the comments. Your voice keeps these stories alive. And if you believe these truths deserve to be pulled out of the dark and placed back into the light, subscribe to this channel, like this video, and help ensure that the suffering empires tried to erase is finally seen. Silence protects power. Speaking it breaks the chain. Let's break it together.